It's so nice to be here. I love you too. I love you because you believe. I love you because you believe in personal freedom. I love you because you believe that the individual is greater than the state and our freedoms come from God and not from the government. We all know that this country was founded on that simple and basic value. When Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, a phrase that everyone in this room has memorized, and if you have grandchildren, your grandchildren will recite it back to you. He was wedding to the United States of America at its birth the concept of natural law, which is that there is an order to the universe created by God which regulates even the government. When Thomas More was on trial for treason, the alleged and under the law at the time proven act of treason was his refusal to acknowledge that the king, Henry VIII, was the head of the church on earth. He represented himself at his own trial. In his closing argument to the jury, he asked the jury this: "Some men say the earth is round and some men say it is flat. But if it is round, could the king's command flatten it? And if it is flat, could an act of parliament make it round?" Now, he was not only appealing to his jurors' common sense. Of course, the king or the parliament couldn't change the shape of the earth. He was appealing to their understanding of the natural law, to their understanding of the truism that the God who created this universe and who created each individual on the universe has created it with an order, with a set of laws and rules that he ordained, a set of rules that operate to restrain even the government. That argument that he made, of course, was not new. It had been articulated by Augustine and Aristotle and Aquinas before him, and it would be picked up by John Locke and Thomas Jefferson after him. You know, when we were colonists and the king and the parliament were looking for unique ways to raise money, they came up with this awful piece of legislation called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required that everybody in the United States, not in Great Britain, but only here, had to have on every piece of paper in their home, every book, every legal document, every financial document, every piece of correspondence, every invoice, even a poster to be nailed to a tree or a pamphlet to be distributed to your neighbors. Every piece of paper had to have a stamp on it that bore the image of the king. You think the post office is bad today? You had to go to a British government post office in the United States to buy these stamps. Question: how did the king and the parliament 3,000 miles away know if you had the king's stamp on every piece of paper in your home? Answer: Parliament enacted a hateful piece of legislation called the Writs of Assistance Act. This law permitted British soldiers to enter your house with a self-written search warrant. So it was not uncommon for there to be a knock at the door and a British soldier would hand you a piece of paper on which he had authorized himself and his men to cross your threshold, ostensibly to look for the stamps. Of course, while they were there, they might help themselves to alcohol if you couldn't prove you had paid a tax on it. They might help themselves to furniture if you couldn't prove that it was made. Everybody knows the opening line of the Bill of Rights. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Now think about that. It doesn't say Congress shall grant freedom of speech. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Why do I emphasize the word the? Because the framers recognized that freedom of speech pre-existed the country, pre-existed them. That the freedom of speech was an aspect of humanity that every person had. And the only time they couldn't exercise the freedom of speech was when a government stopped them from doing so. And so the purpose of creating this new government was to be sure that it would not and could not interfere with the freedom of speech. Of course, along with the freedom of speech, there was articulated in the first 10 amendments other freedoms. Freedom to think, freedom to develop your personality. I've often told O'Reilly he should be grateful for that freedom. Freedom to worship or not to worship. Freedom to travel. Freedom to express your thoughts personally, privately, or in writing and publicly. Freedom to carry and use a gun. Let me tell you, I just stepped on my own shoelace, so I'm going to pull a Glenn Beck and redress myself out here. The purpose of the Second Amendment is not to guarantee the right to shoot deer. It's to guarantee the right to shoot at the government if it is taken over by tyrants. I bet you never heard a politician tell you that. Actually, you probably will in a couple of minutes. We're not allowed to endorse people, but my dear friend Connie Mack will be here, and he shares that view. There is also in the Fourth Amendment the quintessentially American right, the right to be left alone. Today we call it the right to privacy. That's the right that says when the government wants to come across that threshold, as the King and Parliament authorized British soldiers to authorize themselves to do, the government has to go to a neutral judge and present evidence of a crime on the inside of the threshold. Otherwise, it shall not enter and it shall not pass. So the Constitution was ratified, and a few years later, the Bill of Rights were ratified and added to it. And the country began with 2 unanimous elections of George Washington as president. In the second presidency of the United States, John Adams, there arose throughout the country something that seems weird and bizarre to us today. It was fear of the French. You see, Jefferson had been the U.S. ambassador to France, and Jefferson had a lot of friends in France. And Jefferson believed that the individual was greater than the states, and the states were greater than the federal government, and Jefferson was back here. And the government was worried that Jefferson's friends from France would come over here and vote out John Adams, and vote out the big government federalists, and vote in these small government people that believed that the Constitution meant what it said. So before they were kicked out of office, they enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically said, hey, we're a new country, we have open borders. You want to come here? Come. Establish yourself. Vote. Be free. Unless you're coming from France. In which case you have to wait 14 years before you can be an American citizen. Then they added a very troublesome section to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which said, anyone who shall publicly bring the government or the president or the Congress or the Supreme Court into disrepute shall be convicted of a felony and liable to imprisonment for 2 years. Wait a minute. You have that right? Yes, I do. So the question is, how could the same generation, in some cases the very same human beings who wrote just 10 years earlier, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, when they got into power and regulated and controlled the Congress, in fact, write a law that did abridge the freedom of speech? We will see many examples of this throughout American history. I'm going to cite a few more for you. But think about what happens to people when they get into the government and are looking out from the inside and they have in their hands all that power. They are failing to restrain what St. Augustine called, don't go crazy over this phrase, libido dominandi. No, not that kind of libido. Libido dominandi is the lust to dominate. This is a disease that inflicts almost everybody in the government. How many people do you know run for the government and say, I'm going to shrink it. I'm going to decline to exercise the powers that are there so that you will have more freedom. They may say that, but once they get there, we saw this happen with the Founding Fathers. Now with the Alien and Sedition Acts, they do the opposite. Well, a congressman from Vermont couldn't stand the Alien and Sedition Acts, voted against them, argued against them on the floor of the House of Representatives, and he decided to push the envelope. President Adams sometimes got a little carried away and could be seen in Washington, D.C. and in Philadelphia wearing a purple robe. And sometimes Mrs. Adams would sew a gold epaulette on the shoulders, and he could be seen parading around in public wearing that. President Adams also experienced an affliction that happens to a lot of middle-aged men, a problem with his waistline. So Congressman Matthew Lyons of Vermont decided to bring the president into disrepute by mocking his waistline. So he publicly referred to the President of the United States of America, John Adams, as his rotundity. And for that, Congressman Lyons was indicted and prosecuted for violating the Alien and Sedition Acts by publicly bringing the president into disrepute. Congressman Lyons was convicted by a jury in Boston, was sentenced to 2 years in a federal prison in western Massachusetts. You can imagine the conditions 200 years ago. And there he rotted. And then something happened, which if you are from Boston or Chicago or New Orleans or Hudson County, New Jersey, will sound familiar to you. Congressman Lyons ran for re-election from his jail cell. And he won. And when he got back to Washington, Adams was gone. He had been defeated by Jefferson, of all people. There are, unfortunately, so many examples of the government not residing within the confines of the Constitution. But fast forward about 10 years, it's the War of 1812. And the American and British Navy get in a dust-up in the Mediterranean, and the dust-up comes here, and it spreads. And there were British troops all over the United States, and they're trying to capture what they still considered the colonies back for the king. They burn the White House. They burn the Capitol. They occupy states between Virginia and New York. They were marching through a place called Upper Marlborough, Maryland in 1812. A platoon of about 50 or 60 British soldiers. And a militia from this town met the soldiers with arms and captured 6 of them. The next day, the soldiers went into the town and kidnapped 6 townsfolk, whether they were members of the militia or not. So now the town had 6 British soldiers, and the British platoon had 6 members of the town. Mayor John Hodges decides to put an end to this standoff. Each side is threatening to hang the people from the other side. So without any weapons and without any security and without any troops, without any militia, he goes right up to the British captain and he makes a deal. We'll return your troops, your soldiers, you return our townspeople. British captain agrees to it. The troops go back. The townspeople come home. 2 months later, the War of 1812 is over. We win it. The British go home. Upper Marlborough, Maryland has a tumultuous parade in honor of their savior, Mayor John Hodges. Everybody's there. Federal officials, state officials, local officials, they all speak at a podium like this. The mayor gives the final speech. The crowds are going wild. When the mayor finishes his speech, he walks down off the podium, and 2 strangers approach him. The first puts a piece of paper in his hand, and the second takes his wrists and puts them in shackles. They were agents of the federal government sent from Washington, D.C. The piece of paper was an indictment for treason, for providing aid and comfort to the enemy in wartime by returning the British soldiers to their platoon. All right. Now they have to decide what to do, so they hold a trial. The judge at the trial spoke at the podium at the end of the parade that celebrated Mayor Hodges, as did the U.S. attorney that was prosecuting him. U.S. attorney stands up and says, Judge, we don't have to present any evidence. Everybody in this courtroom knows what the mayor did. Defense counsel stands up and said, we don't have to present any defense here because everybody knows what the mayor did. By the way, you see this young man here with the camera? Stand up so they can see you. When I had Freedom Watch, this was the right side of my brain, Austin Peterson. He's now been promoted. He works for Freedom Works, which is one of the reasons you're all here. So the judge says to the jury, think about how the times have changed. Gentlemen, there were no ladies in the jury at the time. Gentlemen, I want you to go across the street to the local tavern. And after you finish drinking, deliberate your verdict and come back here and give it to us. Foreperson raises his hand and says, Your Honor, we don't have to deliberate. We already know the verdict. The mayor is not guilty. Now, what was this? This was the first example in American history of jury nullification. 12 farmers said to the almighty federal government, thou shalt not pass. No matter what is written in a statute books, no one was harmed by this. He risked his life, and you're not going to put him in jail for treason. Now, here's the dark side to this. The Justice Department has a rule that before anybody can be prosecuted for treason, the President of the United States himself must authorize the prosecution. Question: what big government left-wing creep was President of the United States in 1812 that authorized all this? James Madison, the person who wrote the Constitution. All right, fast forward to our own day. You'll remember this. Federal government gets this crazy idea in its head that if we drive a little slower on the highways, we'll save fuel. It doesn't make sense. There's no scientific basis for it. Just like the Stamp Act was really intended just to get the soldiers across the threshold, this was intended to have the feds remind everybody that they're still the boss. But even the liberal Democrats acknowledged that there's nothing in the Constitution that authorizes the federal government to regulate speed. So the Congress decides to appropriate money, which means borrow it from the Chinese, and send it to every state in the union, and basically saying, here's this cash. If you take it, you must use it to repave the federal highways in your state, and you must also agree to lower the speed limits on all highways in your state, whether it's the ones you're repaving or not, down to 55 miles an hour. South Dakota says, forget about it. We haven't driven 55 in this country since the horse and buggy days. We want the money and we don't want the strings. Case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the federal government and said effectively the Congress can bribe the states. Could you imagine if you or I showed up in Tallahassee and said, here's $100 million, now change the law? We'd be arrested before the check was handed over. But the Congress writes laws, and then it writes other laws that lets it break its original laws. It does that all the time. So South Dakota lost. They decided to keep the money, and they lowered the speed limit. What left-wing pinko creep in the White House signed this into law? Ronald Reagan. So you see, something does happen to these people when they get into the government. It started in the earliest days, and it continues up to the present time. Of course, in the present time, we have far more serious issues than Congressman Lyons mocking the president's waistline, and far more serious issues, even though the right to travel is important to all of us, than whether you have to go at 55 miles an hour or whether you can go 65 or faster. We have issues that really go to the very heart of human freedom. We have issues of a government that believes it can write any law, regulate any behavior, and tax any event, whether it's authorized by the Constitution or not. Okay, you're at home one night. There's a knock at the door. You go to the door, you open it up, there's a guy with a gun. What the hell's this all about? The guy says, give me your money. I want to give it away in your name. Now you think, I better call the police. And then you find out he is the police. It is the federal tax collector who has come to take your money and give it away in your name. You wouldn't let this crackpot do it. You wouldn't let a bunch of crackpot neighbors of yours do it. Why the hell do you let the government do it? In the United States of America, there are three ways to acquire wealth. The first is the inheritance model. God bless you. Some relative or friend died and left you a fortune. The second is the economic model. You voluntarily trade with someone else. Your intellect, your skills, your knowledge, the sweat of your brow, your hard work and your time. That's the economic model. The third model is the mafia model. Give me your money or else. Which model does the government use? Again, why do we permit this to happen? You know, the same Declaration of Independence that says that we are created that our rights come from our Creator and are inalienable also says that all the power the government has comes from the consent of the governed. Think of all the things that the government does to us today that no one in this room has ever consented to, and probably the people that you have sent to Washington have never consented to either. Like, for example, the Patriot Act. I was speaking to a group of members of Congress, and, you know, lawyers are taught early on, don't ask a question unless you already know the answer. I said to them, do you folks realize that the Patriot Act permits federal agents to write their own search warrants? Nobody raised their hand. How many of you read the Patriot Act before you voted on it? Nobody raised their hand. The reason I knew they wouldn't know what was in it is because the Patriot Act, which is 315 pages long, was given to members of the House on the internet 15 minutes before they had to vote for it. You are looking at probably one of the few living human beings that managed to get through it who's read the Patriot Act 3 times. It actually amends hundreds of other statutes, so you can't just read the 315 pages one after another. You have to pull out each of the books and the laws that it amends. It takes a long time to read. But it not only permits federal agents to bypass the Fourth Amendment, to cross that threshold of your house on their own, much as the British soldiers did, and for which we fought a revolution, it also makes it a crime for the recipient of this agent-written search warrant to tell anyone that they have received it. So you can't tell your spouse in the bedroom, your lawyer in her or his office, your priest in confessional. You can't even answer truthfully under oath in a public courtroom if you're asked by a judge if you received one of these warrants, because the minute you inform someone you received it, you'll be prosecuted. Don't believe me? 2 FBI agents walk into a library in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and one of them has a self-written search warrant under his arm. I know this sounds like a joke. 2 guys walk into a bar and one of them has a duck under his arm. I won't go there, because there's a lot of families here. The FBI agent hands the search warrant to a volunteer librarian who was 85 years old. She says to him, who the hell are you, sonny? He says, I'm an FBI agent. This is a warrant to allow us to find out who's been reading books in this library. When I think about this, the government owns the building, the government owns the shelves, the government bought the books. How could it possibly be a crime to read a government-owned book from a government-owned library? Nevertheless, the feds were there. She hands this search warrant to her 75-year-old assistant, whereupon the 2 of them are prosecuted for discussing and revealing the existence of the self-written search warrant. 2 years later, the case is ready for trial. On the eve of trial, the federal judge calls the prosecutors and defense counsel in and says, before we start the trial against these 2 young ladies, who are now 87 and 77, I want you to know that tomorrow morning I'm going to be on the front page of the New York Times and every major newspaper in the country because I am about to declare the Patriot Act unconstitutional. What did the feds do? They dismissed the indictment so that she would not have the case before her, so that she would not have what we call the jurisdiction to declare it unconstitutional. This shows you the extent to which the government will go. How many self-written search warrants do you think the government has issued since 9/11? These are federal agents authorizing themselves, just like the British soldiers, to cross the threshold. Over 250,000. From that, they have prosecuted 26 people, 2 of whom were alleged to have been involved in acts of terror. None of the rest of it had anything to do with that. So how can we elect representatives to Congress who will vote to authorize our public servants, federal agents who work for us, to do to us the very same thing that we fought a revolution against the mightiest king and the mightiest army and the mightiest navy at the time, because they did it to us. Because the government is out of control. Because the government thinks it can regulate everything. Because everything the government has doesn't work. Social Security is broke. Medicare broke. Medicaid broke. The post office is broke. Amtrak is broke. Why, when the government took over the Mustang Ranch, because the guys who ran it weren't paying their taxes, they ran that into the ground. So the same government that can't supply hookers and booze to truckers in the desert wants to manage health care. In a couple of minutes after I leave the stage, I don't know if it's before Congressman Mack or after him, you will have the privilege of observing a performance by one of the greatest public speakers in modern America, for whom I had the wonderful opportunity to work when we worked together at the Fox News Channel. He not only understands human nature, he not only understands human freedom, he not only understands the Constitution, he has what people in the government don't have. He is fearless. He's not afraid to say what needs to be said about it. I'm not even going to tell you his name, but you know of whom I speak. On the 19th of October, in the year of our Lord, 2012, 7,000 American patriots assembled in a room in Central Florida, in the United States of America, in order to celebrate human freedom. 50 years. 50 years from now, 10 years from now, 4 years from now, will there be anything left to celebrate? The answer to that lies with everyone in this room. Freedom lies in your heart, but it must do more than just lie there. It must be exercised in the face of the government that would try to take it away. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its maximum hour of danger. You are that generation. The hour is now. Don't shrink from that responsibility. Welcome it. God bless you.